introduce Carl SNYDER, who is professor of chemistry and one of the great men of our time.
Thanks, Andrew. You're very kind. John, you want to focus on the screen? I'm going to be mostly out of it. And secondly, how do we get the house lights dim here? These? Well, I want the lights down there to be dim. I was born. That's me. I know, it's entropy. I was born during the Great Depression, near the end of the Hoover presidency, and I'm on the left. That's October 1932. I'm just a tiny bit over a year old. And on the right, there is Herbert Hoover, and I am delighted to say that I was born during Hoover's presidency. I don't remember a thing about it. Back in those days, the inauguration was in March, so I was almost a year and a half old by the time Hoover ended as president. And the man who succeeded Hoover was FDR. He was elected president on November 8, 1932, and he pulled us out of the Great Depression. You'll notice there are 3 little dots here, so you're going to hear more about this. The sentence isn't ended. FDR pulled us out of the Great Depression, and this is the New York Times edition, came out the day after the election. Roosevelt winner in landslide. Democrats control wet Congress. Layman Governor O'Brien Mayor, that's New York. You might wonder what the wet Congress is. I was also born during Prohibition. The Volstead Act prohibited use of alcoholic beverages. And whatever powers there are, I'm so happy that I was born just at the end of Prohibition. It was over, done, finished. That's Roosevelt. They had a wet Congress. Congress said, we're going to end Prohibition. They did. And that was it. And Churchill and, Roosevelt and Churchill led us to victory in World War II. Well, others will tell you about World War II. Others will give you more information about that. I just want to show you a photograph that I think is a very impressive photograph. That is Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt on board the USS Augusta. And that was in August of 1941, I believe it was. And that's where they signed the Atlantic Charter, which was one of the documents that united the United States and England in the prosecution of the war against Germany, later Japan. And it set the tone for the post-war era, and this was 1941, and this is when the United States began helping England. My earliest memory of national affairs came with Italy's entry into World War II. Now, I was June of 1940. I was 8 years old, and the family lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My father worked for American Telephone and Telegraph Company, and he would go to jobs around Pittsburgh, somewhere around Pittsburgh. And if anybody knows anything at all about western Pennsylvania, you know that Erie is the Pennsylvania port on Lake Erie. It's up in the northwestern part of the state. My mother and I went up to visit my father, who was working in Erie, and it was June of 1940, and there we are on the beach in Erie. I am, I believe, 8 years old at that point. And I remember very clearly with my father walking in Erie, and we came across a newsstand. And there was a newspaper with a headline on it. And my father became very upset when he saw that headline. What I'm going to show you now is the New York Times headline. It wasn't the New York Times that we saw, but this was the headline: Italy at war, ready to attack. Stabbing back, says Roosevelt. Government has left Paris. That I'm showing you because that is my earliest memory of national and international affairs. I was introduced into the world. I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't understand why my father was upset. He explained it to me, and I had some inkling of what he was talking about. There's a war out there, and we might become involved in that war, and Italy's entry into the war makes things pretty bad. I remember very clearly December 7th, 1941. I remember that very clearly. In late November, there was a family transition. It was, I don't want to go into it, but it was healthy, it was wonderful, it was a kind of retirement transition, and my grandfather was involved, but I'm not going into those details. And in late November, we drove from Pittsburgh to Miami, Florida, Miami Beach, and we had a little family vacation. And it was delightful. It was one, I remember it so clearly. And then we drove back to Pittsburgh. We drove through Washington, D.C., and we went through Washington, D.C. the weekend before September 7th, whatever weekend that was, and we saw that the place was closed down. I will tell you just one little item involved in this. As we were driving through the Carolinas, late in November 1941, we saw U.S. troops on exercises. And I remember those U.S. troops had wooden guns. They weren't real guns, because we couldn't afford, as a nation, to outfit our troops with real guns for their exercises. And my parents noted, those are wooden guns. What if there were a war and they needed guns? They don't have them. We drove back, we went to Pittsburgh. Following weekend, my mother and my grandmother, my mother and the father, let me tell you just a little bit. We lived in a two-bedroom apartment, one bath. My grandfather, my grandmother, my father, my mother, my uncle, and I. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath. My uncle and I slept in the living room on makeshift beds. But we had a dog too. The dog was involved in there also. And my mother and my grandmother were sitting out on the porch, and I was Sunday, December 7th, in one of the other rooms, and I was listening to the radio. As you know from the other speakers, everything was radio. We didn't have television. I was listening to something, and the program was interrupted with a report that unidentified aircraft had attacked our naval squadron in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. We'll keep you informed. And I thought to myself, I was 10 years old, and I thought to myself, how the hell can they call these unidentified aircraft? We know where they're from. They can't be American aircraft. They can't be from South America or Central America. There's only one country that could send those aircraft. Why don't they call them by what they really are? And I was 10 years old, and I still remember that I was upset that the broadcast said unidentified aircraft. We have to know who those are that are bombing our squadrons. And I ran out, and I told my grandmother and my mother who were out on the porch, and we realized this was war. Okay, I'm not going to tell you about the war. I'll leave that to others. A little over 3 years later, Roosevelt was dead, and Harry Truman was president. I said it was a little over 3 years later, December of 41 to April of 45. Harry Truman was Roosevelt's vice president, and President Roosevelt was dead. Truman, to continue policies, 9th crosses Elba, nears Berlin. The war was just about over. I was 45. I was 13, I think, at the time. Yeah, I was 13. And I have to tell you, I had just discovered those wonderful, wonderful creatures, girls. But I was not only shy, I was scared. But, you know, things were flowing. And I had a boyfriend, fellow, who was also scared. And the two of us got together, and together we had the courage to go up and visit a girl we knew. We were sitting on her porch, and we were talking. And I was so scared. I really was. I was sitting there. She was so pretty. And this fellow was talking, and he was talking with her, and then I was talking with her. And I was starting to feel, you know, this is what life is all about. This is wonderful. And she had the radio on, and the program was interrupted. There was a news broadcast. We interrupt this program to tell you that President Roosevelt is dead. He died in, I think it was Warren Springs, Georgia. And I never felt, up to that time in my life, so much terror. I didn't know what to do. He'd been president all my life, and I was, I think, 13 years old. And he was the national government. He was president. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 4 terms. And my father, as opposed to Fred, my father loved Roosevelt. He thought Roosevelt was great. We were Democrats, and things were wonderful. And I ran home. scared. I ran home. Mom, Roosevelt's dead. And I didn't know what was going on. And that was my own personal tragedy in 1945. And that is Franklin Roosevelt. He was succeeded by Harry Truman. Nobody knew anything about Harry Truman. Harry Truman, I think, that's my personal opinion, turned out to be a wonderful president. My family was involved in politics, and as you'll see later, I was involved in politics. But Roosevelt was dead, and Harry Truman came in, and after the Yalta Conference of Roosevelt and Stalin, Truman came in because he was now president. And in June of 1945, here are three major figures in the world. There's Churchill, there's Truman, and there's Stalin, and they met in Potsdam in 45 to set up the post-war world. And I wanted to put that photograph in there. It was really historic. I won't go into what Truman did, but I do want to tell you this. To end the war quickly in the Pacific and avoid an Allied invasion of Japanese islands, Truman ordered the atomic bomb dropped on Japan. Now remember the atomic bomb being dropped on Japan. I have to tell you that possibly from the presidency of Herbert Hoover, from then on, possibly, I was a chemist. I think I was born to be a chemist. And I was the delight of my chemistry teacher in high school. I loved her, she loved me, I loved chemistry. And I heard that an atomic bomb had been dropped. Well, this was a complete secret. We didn't have any idea what an atomic bomb was. And I thought to myself, and I still remember this, but all bombs are atomic bombs. All bombs have atoms in them. Why are they calling this an atomic bomb? What is going on here? Why is this an atomic bomb? You get TNT, you get anything of that sort, dynamite, whatever it is, it's got atoms in it. I remember thinking that, and I was driven by a very profound curiosity to find out, why is this called an atomic bomb? And I went on and learned a lot about atomic bombs and how they work, but that was part of my education right there. 8 days later, World War II ended, and the wonderful post-war era had begun. And it was a wonderful post-war era because the constrictions on us were over. Japan surrendered, end of war, Emperor accepts Allied rule, MacArthur, Supreme Commander, our manpower curbs, boy, there were curbs on how you could use workers, there were wage controls, there was rationing, there was all sorts of things, and suddenly in 45, we were all alive again. We were celebrating. Life was wonderful. Harry Truman, who reached the presidency through the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was elected in his own right in 1948. Before continuing, I want to tell you about that. If you study history at all, you find that everybody believed Truman didn't have a chance. Dewey was going to be elected, and maybe you've seen this photograph. I tried to get it for this presentation. I couldn't find it. Pardon me?
Dewey defeats Truman?
Yes, Dewey defeats Truman. Great photograph.
That was the headline.
That was the headline. The headline, Dewey defeats Truman. Everyone thought Dewey was going to win. Let me tell you the story behind that. Truman was a loser. He didn't have a chance. Dewey was suave. He was articulate. He was everything you expect a lawyer to be. He was a New York lawyer. He was really great, and he just overwhelmed Truman. And the Chicago Daily Tribune staff was so certain that Dewey was going to beat Truman that the night of the election, they printed up a paper with the headline, Dewey defeats Truman. They didn't want to wait for the results. They all went to bed. They published it. And there's a picture of Truman smiling like you've never seen anyone smile before. He's holding this up. Dewey defeats Truman. Truman won in 48. Of course, it wasn't an easy time that he had. You may hear about this later. He had to remove MacArthur. We had the Korean War. We had all kinds of problems, but we're not going to go into that. Truman was succeeded in 1952 by Dwight David Eisenhower, and my personal feelings show through here, the general who had led the Allied armies to victory over the Nazis. Eisenhower was a father figure. He was elected overwhelmingly by an electorate steeped in the old mores and old traditions, and Eisenhower brought with him as vice president Richard M. Nixon, and I'm going to show you the headline. I'm going to show you the picture of Eisenhower and Nixon, and I have never seen a more accurate photograph of Richard Nixon. Eisenhower won, but I've got to give you a little bit of background here too. I had no problem with Eisenhower, but he was the father. He was the man who led us to victory. He was the man who was keeping America what we had all intended it to be. Running against Eisenhower was a man I admired so much, Adlai Stevenson. I don't know if you know anything about Adlai Stevenson, but he captivated me. Adlai Stevenson was an intellectual, articulate, witty, two of my favorite words, bright, had good ideas. Now let me just tell you one small thing about Adlai Stevenson. He was called an egghead. Have you ever heard the statement, workers of the world arise, you have nothing to lose but your chains? Well, Stevenson was called an egghead, and he turned around and he says, I'm an egghead. Eggheads of the world arise, you have nothing to lose but your yolks. And that was Stevenson. Yeah, he had a hole in the shoe. And Zach, I still have my lapel pin, my Stevenson lapel pin with a shoe with a hole in it. I want to tell you that I was in when was the second election? Must have been about 1950. In 52 was succeeded, so 52 plus 4, 56. I was in graduate school. I was in Ohio State, and since you mentioned the hole in the shoe, my wife and I married as a senior, and I married my wife. We met we didn't go to the same high schools, but we met at the end of our high school years. And we were so enraptured by Stevenson that we decided to work for Stevenson. I was about 2 years away from my degree. We worked hard. We were precinct workers. We were recognized by the local political group, and we were invited to some of the meetings, and we participated. And we worked so hard. And I have to tell you, not only did we lose our precinct to Eisenhower, we lost the city of Columbus, Ohio to Eisenhower. We lost Franklin County to Eisenhower. The state of Ohio went to Eisenhower, and the country went for Eisenhower. And I felt, it's hopeless. I'm just going to stick to chemistry. Anyway, Eisenhower won in a landslide. He brought Nixon with him. 2 months before the election, that is the first election, 52. 2 months before the election, I had begun my junior year at the University of Pittsburgh. Now, I want you to turn back the clock. You might see me sitting next to someone like you in a room like this. And I want you to think for a moment. I was beginning my junior year. We're all here at LC 140, and Dwight David Eisenhower and Richard M. Nixon are about to be elected President and Vice President of the United States of America, and that was me back in September 1952. That's my college identification photo. We had that. And I was more or less your age as Eisenhower and Nixon came to America.
Is that a mugshot?
Well, let me answer that by saying I served my time. During Eisenhower's first term, we come now to the 60s, although it wasn't the 60s yet, events in Southeast Asia began laying the foundation for the 60s. May 7, 1954, Dien Bien Phu was lost after 55 days. No word of De Castries and his men. Dulles says unity can check Reds. 1954. Back in those days, Southeast Asia was a colonial empire. It was known as, has anyone ever heard the term French Indochina? Okay, French Indochina, the French were powerful there. And the Vietnamese revolted against the French. The French retreated into their sanctuary at Dien Bien Phu. They were trapped in Dien Bien Phu, and they lasted for 55 days. And then they finally had to give up. And when the French gave up Dien Bien Phu, the Vietnamese had their country in French Indochina. Dulles was, as Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. But that in 54 was beginning to lay the foundations of the 60s. July 20, 1954, Indochina armistice is signed. Vietnam split at the 17th parallel. We now have a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam. U.S. finds it can, as the New York Times put it, quote, respect the pact. Events here at home laid the foundation for the 60s as well. May 1754, High Court bans school segregation, 9-0 decision grants time to comply. Segregation in schools is unconstitutional, but the South, you do have some time to comply with this. Take your time, take as long as you want. President Eisenhower was reelected by a landslide in November 1956. The final chapter of the prelude to the 1960s began with the election of John F. Kennedy on November 9, 1960. Kennedy's victory won by close margin. He promises fight for world freedom. Eisenhower offers orderly transition. The era, brief but wonderful, the era of John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy had begun. Kennedy was a break from the past. He was vigorous, articulate, witty. He generated electricity and expectation. Eisenhower was the father figure I can't say needed Eisenhower. I think Stevenson would have been better. I still think that. But Eisenhower was the United States of America in the 50s. Kennedy promised something different. Kennedy told us that by end of the decade, we'd have a man on the moon. Kennedy established the Peace Corps. Kennedy was electricity incarnate, as far as I'm concerned. The Kennedy years. And let me take you through the Kennedy years. 1961. I arrived at the University of Miami as an assistant professor in 1961, which was the year the first black students were permitted to register. The University of Miami was integrated in 1961. January 3, this is under the Eisenhower administration, shortly before the inauguration. The U.S. breaks its diplomatic ties with Cuba and advises Americans to leave the island. Eisenhower cites vilification by Castro. I remember so very clearly in the very, very early 60s, standing on Dixie Highway at the university and seeing truckload after truckload of troops going down south on Dixie Highway. I remember seeing missile batteries being brought down Dixie Highway and going south. In the early 60s, my wife and I were driving down in the Everglades, just looking around, and we came across a missile battery in the Everglades. Pointed skyward, troops, all that. You could see it. It was scary. It was scary. Nobody knew what was going to happen, and we were right here. April 1961, anti-Castro units land in Cuba, report fighting at Beachhead. Rusk says U.S. won't intervene. We know that now as the Bay of Pigs. 1962, September 29, Kennedy federalizes Mississippi's Guard, mobilizes troops, orders state to yield, addresses nation today on racial crisis. The black students wanted to go to school. The whites said no. October, 3,000 troops put down Mississippi rioting and seized 200 as Negro attends classes. Ex-General Walker is held for insurrection. As you'll see in a moment, this is not yet what I define as the 60s. But they're coming. October 22nd, 1962. The U.S. imposes arms block on Cuba on finding offensive missile sites. Kennedy ready for Soviet showdown, the missile crisis. And we were right here in Miami, my wife and I. We had kids. We weren't scared, but we ought to have been. October 28, 62. U.S. and Soviet reach accord on Cuba. Kennedy accepts Khrushchev's pledge to remove missiles under UN watch. Kennedy did it. He did it without going to war. He did it without firing any shots. Maybe he was lucky. I'm not, who's going to argue with that? Luck or not, he did it. 1963, August 28. 200,000 march for civil rights in orderly Washington rally. President sees gain for Negro. That was when the Reverend Martin Luther King gave his speech, "If I Have a Dream." things were beginning to look up a bit. Things were beginning to show a little bit of promise. Kennedy faced down Khrushchev. The march in Washington was peaceful and optimistic. And then, on November 1st, 1963, rebels in Vietnam oust Diem, report him and new suicides, sharper fight on Red's Vow. Things were getting ugly in Vietnam. Diem was ousted. North and South Vietnam were moving farther apart or closer together, however you may want to define it. But then we have November 22nd, 1963. I had laboratories on Friday, November 22nd, and the laboratories were held in wooden buildings that are now part of the art department. We call them the shacks. They were chemistry laboratories. And I was down there. I had responsibility for a laboratory, and we had assistants, so I was just sitting in the office with a friend of mine. Maybe you remember Henry Hubbinger. You remember Henry Hubbinger? We were sitting in his office talking. Phone rang. Henry picked it up and says, "Your wife." She's calling before. I picked up the phone. She said, "I just heard on the radio. Kennedy's been shot." I said, "I remember." I said, "Where?" "Shot." "Oh, in the arm, in the leg?" "Well, what was it?" "I don't know." "Well, look, he's been shot. Others have been shot. Let me know when you hear where he's shot." "Okay." I hung up. Henry and I kept talking. Phone rings. Henry picks up. "It's your wife." "Kennedy's dead." I'll never forget that moment. The physics building was not where it is. That was a wooded area, a lot like the Arboretum. Just wooded. We closed the laboratory. I walked back to my car. It was late in the afternoon by this time. And I have never heard the earth so quiet. There was no sound. I was thinking to myself, the world has changed. What is it going to be now? It will never be the same. And the earth was as quiet as I have ever heard it. Kennedy had been in Dallas. Just before that, he was in Miami, and I thought, I don't think I'll go to see him. I just don't feel like going to see him. He was in Dallas, and his motorcade, back in those days, they had open cars. His motorcade was taking him to some other place. I don't know. He was going to give a speech. Vice President Johnson was with him. He was back a few cars. His wife Carolyn was seated next to him. And John Connally, who's governor of Texas, was sitting in front of him. They were in Dallas. They rounded the corner, went past the Texas School Book Depository, and you know the rest of the story. There were, we believe, 3 bullets fired. The first bullet passed through what was called the soft tissue of Kennedy's neck. And here you see him after the first bullet. He's raising his arms in response to the bullet passing through his neck. There is a little bit of shock here in the front. That's over here is Connally. And the bullet is passing through his body now. And it did some pretty serious damage to Connally. There was another shot, I believe. It was never quite clear. The third shot destroyed John F. Kennedy's brain. Friday, November 22nd, 1963. On the presidential airplane carrying Kennedy's body back to Washington, the era of the 60s begins as Lyndon Baines Johnson is sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. And my own opinion is that the era of the 60s began with the bullet that killed John F. Kennedy, brought Lyndon Johnson to the presidency, took us full force into Vietnam, led to urban riots, and all the other things you're going to hear in the rest of this course. Thank you.